Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Dmitry Gozubinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and this is the second session of Geneva Trade Week 2021. For those of you returning to us after our opening plenary session, welcome back, and let me reassure you my remarks will not be nearly as long. In fact, I'm really only here to introduce Dr. Carolyn Dier-Birkbeck, the Director of TESS, the Forum on Trade, the Environment, and the SDGs. TESS is a partnership between the Graduate Institute and the UN's Environment Program. It was launched over the summer to promote informed and inclusive dialogue on trade, the environment, and to place that dialogue in the context of the wider effort to achieve sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to do so with a special focus on engaging developing country governments and stakeholders. We at the Geneva Trade Platform are immensely proud to house the TESS initiative, and we try to play a small supporting role as it demystifies the trade and environment dialogue and moves it forward. A key part of that support is knowing when to get the heck out of the way, and given the caliber of the panel and the importance of today's subject, I will do just that. So let me thank you all for coming and hand the floor straight over to you. Dr. Birkbeck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri, for the very kind introduction, and thank you for agreeing to host this event as part of Geneva Trade Platform's Geneva Trade Week. So it's my pleasure to moderate our briefing today on what's happening on the environment at the WTO. We're going to focus on recent developments and also WTO member initiatives in the lead up to the 12th Ministerial Conference, which will be held at the end of November this year. As Dimitri has outlined, one of the key goals of TESS is to bring stakeholders and governments together in dialogue about how we can promote and support action on trade, environment, and sustainable development issues. So I'm delighted to report the really high interest in this briefing today. We're very lucky that we've been able to have some people with us here in person in Geneva in the auditorium, and we thank very much those of you who made the effort to come in person. We have around 200 people who are online, really from around the world, from government, civil society, business, and also think tanks and academia. Most exciting from my point of view is that they come from all over the world. So we have people listening in today from South Africa, Ecuador, Canada, Sweden, China, India, Sri Lanka, and Europe and the United States as well. So that's just a fraction of who we have out there. And I think it's really important that we're able to bring these discussions in Geneva out to stakeholders around the world, many of whom are very interested in understanding more about what's happening. So the level of interest demonstrates the importance and relevance of advancing discussions at the WTO on issues at the nexus of trade and sustainability. And indeed, there are strong justifications for this interest. Faced with the triple environmental crises of climate change, nature loss, and pollution, there are growing calls for trade and trade policies to better support international efforts to address these problems and at the same time to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And to be sure, that is not easy at all. And so we need to be especially conscious that many developing countries are keen to be partners in this effort, but we need to ensure that our global economic frameworks are fair and support their efforts to compete in a green global economy and not to be marginalized as we go forward in efforts to try and increase sustainability. So at TESS, we believe it's really vital to promote this kind of dialogue among the diversity of the WTO membership and also to bring in the range of relevant stakeholders. So the aiming of this briefing today is to provide a one-stop overview of what's at play in the WTO at the moment on environmental issues, both in the work of WTO's regular committees and in the Secretariat, and also in the context of some member-led initiatives in the lead up to MC12. So I'm going to turn over to our 5 speakers. We'll start with Jean-Marie Paugam, who's the Deputy Director General at the WTO. Then we'll move to Ambassador Tihanki, who is the permanent representative of the Philippines to the WTO and also chairs the WTO's Committee on Trade and Environment. Then we'll move to Ambassador Stephen de Boer, who is the permanent representative and ambassador of Canada to the WTO. And then to Maria Daniela Garcia, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Ecuador to the WTO. And Alison Hamilton, who is the Deputy Representative of New Zealand to the WTO. And those speakers will well, I'll introduce them more when it gets to their particular remarks. I think that would be better. So in the second segment, we'll have a Q&A. For those of you who are online, it would be really useful if you could submit any questions through the chat or the Q&A in the Zoom. Please state your name and affiliation, because we won't take any questions that are not that are anonymous. And for those of you who are in the room, we will take some live questions afterwards. But if you're worried we won't get to you, then please submit them on the chat anyway as well if you're enrolled, because then I can at least draw them to the attention of our speakers afterwards, because I'm sure they'll be interested in the kinds of comments and questions that we have. So let's get started. Each of our speakers will provide 7 to 8 minutes. I have a fantastic Swiss mountain bell here, which I will ring at 7 minutes, just in case anyone is going over time. So let's get started. I'd like to start by inviting Jean-Marie Paugam. In his work at the WTO, he oversees work on trade and environment, on agriculture and commodities, as well as the trade policy review. So a huge portfolio, actually. And previously, he was the permanent representative of France to the WTO. Jean-Marie, just in case anyone is going over time. So let's get started.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Caroline, thank you very much for this kind invitation. You asked me to provide an overview of what is happening on trade and the environment in the WTO. I'd like first to take a step back, because if you want to really get sense of what is happening into the WTO, you need to see what is happening outside the WTO. And I think that there are three main changes in terms of relation of trade and the environment, three main changes which are happening all over the place. The first one is a change of vision. There was this idea traditionally in the mind, especially in the mind of negotiators, that the environment was before all a cost. A tax on growth, an obstacle to growth. And today we're moving to exactly the opposite. It is unsustainable models of trade and production and consumption which are becoming the threat to the economy. So the vision of the environment as a cost is moving from the vision of the environment as an opportunity for innovation in the green economy. The second change is a change of mindset. In the trade world, we always saw environment as an exception to trade rule. That was not bad. It just meant that environment had a superior value to trade, but it was just outside of our realm to discuss the environment. There has been a complete change of mindset since our negotiators are today looking at the trade as a possible solution for environment. So moving from an exception to a solution is a very important change. And the last change is a change of method. Trade negotiations traditionally are about give and take. We call that trade concessions. And what is being asked from the trade negotiation today is to contribute to the achievement of collective goals in terms of public goods. And we are learning that into the WTO, of course, with a fishery negotiation, because a fisheries negotiation is not about trade concession. It's not about some countries may lose, some countries may win. Is that if we fail in achieving this global public good of the ocean preservation, we'll all lose. So in other words, since we are in an academic setting, I may say that we are trying to move from the invisible hand of Adam Smith to the cooperative equilibrium from John Nash in terms of game theory. So this is big, and this is happening slowly into the WTO. It's happening, we see it in the private sector. I think corporate social responsibility in many respects is leading the path in contributing to restructuring business processes in the sense that I was mentioning. I think green finance is quite a fast maturing sector also, sometimes led by a development bank. And trade policy is also itself in the process of transforming itself. It is very visible at the level of unilateral, such as preferences, or bilateral, such as FTA instrument, where the environment is quite maturing fast. But it's also coming within the WTO. So where do we stand in the organization? There are several layers. The first one of our multilateral discussion is everything which is happening in our committee on trade and environment. I would just limit myself to saying that over the last 3 to 5 years, this discussion has been very significantly revitalized, in particular under the leadership of our chair, Ambassador Tihanki here. And the discussions are covering most of the major topics today: deforestation, climate change, circular economy, ocean preservation. So there is a very lively dynamic here. The second one is that the environment and sustainable development concerns are pervading increasingly through most of WTO technical discussions. And let me give me an example with climate change, which is very interesting. When you talk about climate change, you see it officially nowhere on the WTO agenda. But when you look at the discussions and what they are concretely, you find climate change everywhere. You find it in the discussion of the Council of Trade and Goods, for trade in goods, for instance, with the discussions about carbon adjustment pricing at the border, which have been starting. You find it in trade and services, where there are propositions from our members about liberalizing the trade in services, which helped combating the climate change. You find it in agriculture, where the link between distorting subsidies and climate change is being also scrutinized. And of course, you find it in a very technical area, which is sometimes complex to for the external world, which we call TBT, which is technical barriers to trade. And this is actually the most lively one, because this is where our members are discussing all the standards and regulations that they take to achieve goals such as climate change. And if you want to have a more quantitative vision of that, we have an environmental database which shows that our members are using more and more trade as a leverage to achieve environmental objectives, because they notify to us trade-related measures, environmental motivated trade-related measures, which are being captured in our database. And just in a nutshell, this is growing fast in areas such as plastics or circular economy, animal welfare, and others. And last, several groups of our members have initiated some very important plurilateral discussions. You know that plurilateral is less than multilateral, which are trying to converge to some political initiatives at our next ministerial conference called by the end of the year. The oldest one is probably the fossil fuel subsidy reform, which is being pushed by some members, including New Zealand, which is present on the panel. One very focused one is on plastic, led by China and Fiji. It's called Initiative on Dialogue on Plastic. And the most comprehensive one, probably the most ambitious, is called a little bit like your research center is called TEST. So it's Structured Discussion on Trade and Sustainable Development, which is about reinvigorating a work program and maybe sometimes a negotiation on trade and the environment. So this is what we have in the WTO. Let me say a word about the fisheries negotiation, which is really the most important priority of the organization, and of course, the most important sustainable development negotiation. I'll just remind you all that these negotiations have been going on for 20 years. We are hopefully in the final phase. We want to achieve those negotiations before our ministerial meeting in November. And we are now very deeply involved in a text-based process under the leadership of our chairman, Ambassador Santiago Wills from Colombia. Where do we stand? Some members have described specific changes to their support for fisheries that the new disciplines would require them to make, and they have indicated a willingness to make those changes. I'm being told that less encouragingly, however, too many drafting suggestions now are coming back with a view to maintain and even resurrect some positions which have not attracted convergence in the past. So the time is extremely short for reaching an agreement. To get to a deal that will make a positive difference for sustainability in the oceans, all members will have to contribute proportionately to the outcome. I let you imagine that having no result would be the worst possible outcome, both for fish and maybe to some extent for our organization for systemic reasons, since this, I cannot say it enough, this negotiation is the most important one in terms of signal of the WTO readiness to engage into sustainability in the future. I hope I don't get the bell. So happy to hand over the floor back to you, Caroline. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. And I was listening too carefully, actually, to keep track of the time. So I can't say whether you were in time or not, but thank you very much for the overview and for providing us a sense of also what's going on in the fisheries subsidies reform negotiations. We had hoped also to have Ambassador Wills here today, but unfortunately he had other engagements. But I'm sure if there are questions afterwards, we might be able to answer those. So I'm going to turn directly now to Ambassador Tihanki, who, as I said, is the Philippines ambassador to the WTO and chair of the CTE. He has been chair of the CTE before in 2007, and for several years was also the chair of the special session. And one thing I should note about him is he's also an academic and scholar and has written a book on trade and environment governance at the WTO, which is focused specifically on the CTE. So if anyone is listening who is doing scholarship or research on the CTE, I really commend the book to you because it's a really unique glimpse at this issue from the perspective of someone who's also negotiated and chaired negotiations on these topics. So Ambassador, would you like to talk from there?
Is the mic working from here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that advertisement. And may I ask just how long, how many minutes was Jean-Marie? 7, okay. You better ring your... So anyway, of course, thank you to the Graduate Institute and to Caroline for this invitation. And of course, to my fellow panelists, they have more to say on the specifics. And thank you, Jean-Marie, our eminent DDG, passionate with and trade and environment. May I just say former chair as well of the committee that I'm now chairing. And our fellow panelists, of course, will speak on fossil fuels, TESD, and plastics, 3 very important initiatives. As part of my introduction, I do note that this is the trade and environment and SDGs. Your group, Caroline, is on the SDGs. And so, and how trade and environment and the WTO, part of what's happening is how the WTO could mainstream and contribute to the SDGs, which I think more and more people are changing the tone of the debate, that we are now actually more cohesive, more coordinated. And I have my favorite on why the SDGs are important, is that first and foremost, among the topics being discussed that is SDG related is sustainable agriculture, brought forward at the last meeting by a group of countries from Latin America. And of course, while you're speaking on plastics, you could probably also say on that. So, and then I see goal 6 of the SDGs is the availability of water and sanitation for all. So I think definitely there has been lots of discussion at the committee over the last 25 years on the importance of this issue to developing countries. Then affordable, reliable energy for all, which is SDG 7. We have Madam Fossil Fuels from New Zealand, and a lot of discussion on solar, on some possible sectors in market access, renewable energies. There's been lots of discussions on the WTO. And then, of course, on sustainable consumption and production patterns, very hot topic today, which is SDG 12, the circular economy, as already mentioned by DDG Jean-Marie. Goal 13, it directly tackles climate change and its impact. And more, as mentioned by our DDG, from 2009, a very important junction in the debates at the CTE and the WTO was the joint report on climate change and trade, done jointly by UNEP and the WTO, which kind of moved the debate at the CTE to a more mutually supportive approach. So today, discussing climate change, while in the beginning was a very big concern, more and more it's being discussed at the CTE and how to address this climate crisis. Then we have, of course, SDG 14, the use of the oceans, and I'm just happy the CTE is not at the forefront. We leave that to Chairman Santiago Wills of the Rules and Fisheries, but there, the committee, to the extent it can, and the WTO is very active in hoping a result on the fishery subsidies. Then we have, of course, forests in Goal 15 and Goal 17. I think the most important is the WTO is part of a global partnership with other organizations. And so we are monitoring closely COP26, which is happening in November as we approach MC12. So indeed, the CTE is not a negotiating platform. There is the special session, which with the Doha round has kind of gone into some hibernation. There is discussions on how to revive those discussions at the CTE-SS. But from the CTE perspective, it's mainly a dialogue platform for spreading knowledge, experience sharing, and indeed triggering new ideas. As we have seen, there are new ideas already on plastics. Fossil fuels has been in the discussion for a long time. And of course, TESDI, it will be discussed in detail by Ambassador De Boer, but it's more a more comprehensive approach that allows structured discussions to take place on a non-binding basis outside the committee, but also within the committee as an interface. So there is a lot happening in terms of what the WTO could do in the lead up to MC12. So of course, what is it that we're doing in the lead up to MC12? We are hoping indeed that ministers, as they gather for the first time after 4 years, this will be the first ministerial conference of the WTO, that they indeed provide some guidance, some sort of impetus to all members and send a signal to the outside world that trade and environment, sustainability and inclusivity is indeed a very important topic, together with, of course, the pandemic, the WTO's contribution to the pandemic recovery, and how we can indeed ensure that there's equitable access to vaccines, as well as equitable and free access to free and safe water, less pollution, renewable energy, and all these issues that are becoming mainstream today. So that's what's happening in the WTO and at the committee. I'll leave some time for more questions later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and another one who stuck just to time, so that's perfect. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador De Boer, who is Canada's ambassador to the WTO. Interestingly, I always like reviewing your biography, because really you started your career in Global Affairs Canada in the Environment Directorate and have negotiated on issues like climate change before moving to the trade side. Ambassador Boer is also with the Ambassador of Costa Rica, the co-chair of the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you for reminding the group that I am here on behalf of the co-convener for TESDI, Ambassador Gloria Abraham of Costa Rica. It's Canada and Costa Rica that are co-chairing this process. And it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Gloria as well, to talk about the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, and to provide you with an update on the discussions and the work that's been done by participants to date. It's more clear than ever that there's an urgent need for action on climate and environmental issues. And it's also a good moment to ask what can be done to ensure that trade and environmental objectives and policies are mutually supportive. The members of the TESDI came together with the shared belief that the WTO has an important role to play in this discussion. Members hope to complement the work already taking place in the Committee on Trade and the Environment and in other WTO committees and bodies. And they believed that a dedicated discussion group would be useful, and a useful way of enhancing collaboration and incubating new ideas and how the membership could advance their environmental goals. And you heard from the chair of CTE talking about TESDI as an interface with the CTE, and that certainly is one of the notions. When the structured discussions were first launched in November of 2020, 53 interested members expressed their goal of intensifying discussions on environmental themes, and they also hoped, where appropriate, to put forward concrete deliverables, initiatives, and next steps to advance work on environmental issues at the WTO. These discussions have been open to any WTO member, and we've been pleased by the level of engagement, even from countries that did not sign on to the original communication. The initiative is also a bit unusual in the WTO context, as it includes direct participation of international organizations and other relevant actors, including the private sector. The aim is to having these organizations in the room to benefit from their experience and to bring new ideas to the table. We've also been very pleased by the open exchanges that have been allowed, and we appreciate the different perspectives that they have brought to the work. And since the launch of TESTI, there have been 4 meetings of the Structured Discussion Group. During the course of these meetings, we've had an opportunity to hear from the membership about their priorities and hopes for the future of these discussions. Members have raised a broad range of interests, from decarbonization of supply chains, circular economy, trade and climate change, just to name a few. It is clear from the number of areas that have been raised that there is a real interest in exploring different trade and climate-related policy discussions. In our more recent meetings, we've had the opportunity to explore some of the areas through presentations by members, Secretariat, and outside groups. As an example, at the meeting earlier this month, we heard presentations on sustainable food and agriculture, trade-related climate measures, and perspectives from developing countries on promoting trade in environmental goods. All of these sessions have allowed for robust exchange between members and the presenters, which have highlighted the value of these discussions. In the course of our meetings, we've also heard from some members about the importance of a roadmap, which would allow us to move beyond information exchange and find ways to put into action some of the ideas that have been discussed. Currently, the co-sponsors are at work on a ministerial statement to be signed at MC12. Through this statement, the co-sponsors will reaffirm their commitment to advancing work on environmental issues at the WTO, recognize the work and discussion that's taken place over the course of this year, highlight areas for future discussion and exchanges, and lay out a roadmap to implement the activities described in the statement. It is our hope that the final draft will reflect a broad range of areas for discussion and future action. One of the goals is to ensure that members will be able to see themselves and their interests reflected in the statement. Ideally, we would like to see a number of signatories expand beyond the original number and bring together a broad range of members. By opening up more avenues for discussion and collaboration, we believe that TESTI can provide a valuable contribution to advancing work on environment and climate change issues. With the eyes of the world turning to the WTO, now is the moment to demonstrate that the WTO can meaningfully contribute to global efforts to combat the myriad of environmental sustainability challenges we face. I and my fellow co-convener look forward to the new statement that will be signed at MC12. We are also eager to see how the membership takes all of the ideas that have been discussed to date and begin to translate them into action as we move beyond MC12. Thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with participants here on the work of TESTI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that overview. I note that you advised us you need to leave a little early, so I'm going to use my prerogative to just ask you one question before you leave, before we turn to the other speakers. And that's simply, I'm thinking from the point of view of stakeholders who are listening. We have colleagues from academia, some officials in environment ministries and capitals, people from the business sector and civil society. How can they help in this effort between now and MC12? I think there's a lot of interest out there among stakeholders in ensuring that the trading system promotes environmental sustainability. And just, do you have any advice on what would help your work in the next few months from them?
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So there's a couple of things I would say, and the one is, do not discount the possibility of working through your own delegations. But then I would also say, to work with the existing stakeholder base that is supporting the work of TESTI. There's a lot of interest in increasing the participation, but I don't think we're at that stage yet with respect to the amount of work we need to do between now and MC12. But there is space for those voices. And obviously the way that, I shouldn't say obviously, but the way that TESTI has been created with input from stakeholders, from the private sector, these are voices that are very important. So I would suggest that we work within the existing network of stakeholders and the members to the WTO to bring those stories forward, to bring their advice forward. We do need, that advice if we're going to bring about practical steps on the road to MC12 and post MC12. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I recall when the process, all of these discussions started sort of 18 months or so, one of your colleagues had mentioned to me the most important thing was that government officials in capital hear that there's a national demand from this, from national stakeholders. So that's something that I think is really important that we bear in mind, especially if one of the goals is to expand the range of countries who, as you said, see themselves as being stakeholders in this process as well and in taking the discussion forward. And if I may just commend you and Ambassador Peralta for your efforts in really trying to make the statement one that is inclusive and that many countries can indeed see themselves as having an interest in participating in. So I'll turn now to our next speaker, who is Daniela Garcia from the Mission of Ecuador to the WTO. She's a career Foreign Service diplomat, and she's previously served in Australia and New Zealand, which I didn't realize till last night, which is nice. And she is playing a leading role as one of as Ecuador is one of the co-conveners or co-chairs of the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade at the WTO. Ecuador is one of 17 co-sponsors, but I will turn to Daniela to provide you more information about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to all the presenters, ambassadors, and representatives here today, to the participants, for showing this great interest on this very important topic. All the briefings we have listened, we are listening today illustrate that the WTO can and should contribute with a trade and environment agenda, and that developed and developing countries, we do share a common goal here. We want a more sustainable trade. We do need to do this in a way that reflects all members' views and interests, and that's why the dialogue on plastics is for. Ecuador is a proud co-coordinator of the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, IDP. The dialogue started out of the recognition from several developing countries of the need for a coordinated action to address the rising environmental, health, economic cost of plastic pollution and the importance of the trade dimension as a part of the solution. I think we all agree that plastic pollution is a global problematic that needs a global, comprehensive and coordinated response, but also that there are many opportunities for all of us to transit into a more circular economy on plastics. Today, we are 18 members, developing and least developing economies, co-sponsoring the IDP from all the regions. We are actively exchanging our views, ideas, and perspectives on this area, with the aim to identify opportunities for enhanced trade cooperation within the rules and mechanisms of the WTO, to support domestic, regional, and global efforts to reduce plastics pollution and transition to a more circular and environmentally sustainable global plastics economy, while avoiding also duplication of work. The dialogue that is being led by Australia, Barbados, China, Fiji, Ecuador, and Morocco is now open to all WTO members, and in the same line with the TSST, with which we share a common goal, we have a multi-stakeholder approach. We believe that this has made the debate rich and diverse, and that this is reflected in the quantity, diversity, and breadth of topics that have been covered until now. From the start, the IDP offered enhanced opportunities for stakeholder engagement and for WTO delegations to be briefed about relevant efforts and initiatives on the topic. Also for academic research. In total, in 2021, 15 stakeholders have shared their views with us, many of them here with us today. The discussions have revolved around identified 6 subjects: improving transparency and monitoring trade trends, promoting best practices, cooperating with other international processes and efforts, identifying the scope for collective approaches, strengthening policy coherence, and assessing capacity and technical assistance need for developing and least developed countries. Now, what's on the IDP for MC12? Well, we have taken stock of all the discussions on the 6 aspects that I mentioned, mainly during the discussions this year, in a document with elements with the aim of delivering a ministerial declaration for MC12. But also, we are discussing on areas which can be subject for debate next year. Of course, we seek to emphasize the importance of the topic, express our political will of all the co-sponsors, and the relevance of trade policy in this sphere, where the IDP is a WTO platform to debate how organization can support ongoing and future efforts to address plastic pollution, including by identifying challenges and opportunities for developing countries in the circular economy. I will finish my intervention by stressing the synergies between the IDP and the TSSD, as both dialogues do effectively demonstrate the ability of the WTO to contribute positively to climate and environmental objectives. The next IDP dialogue will take place in October 22. It will be chaired by our fellow co-coordinator, Australia, and will focus on discussing the draft ministerial declaration and reach out to members to endorse this declaration for December. Thank you to all. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for that overview. So just before I turn to Alison, just to emphasize that I think in both cases, the member-led initiatives are open to all members to participate in. Members can participate whether or not they officially co-sponsor, but there's also an effort to encourage a wider group of countries to co-sponsor so they also have ownership of these initiatives. And in both instances, that will be a real goal between now and MC12, is to agree on a text and also then to promote it with a wider range of countries signing on. So I think the last speaker today is Alison Hamilton, who is the DPR of New Zealand, and she will talk to us about, as Jean-Marie mentioned, the oldest of the member-led initiatives and your goals for MC12 as well.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much, and thanks in particular to the Graduate Institute, the Geneva Trade Platform, and the Forum on Trade and Environment and SDGs for bringing us together today. It's heartening to see such a full agenda, and I'm very pleased just to speak to one of those items on the agenda. The item I will speak on is the New Zealand-led, along with our friends of fossil fuel subsidy reform, agenda to deliver a revised joint ministerial statement for MC12. My update on this statement fits nicely, I think, at the end of the updates that we've heard already, because our work hooks into the Committee on Trade and Environment, the structured discussions, and I really appreciated Ambassador Tihanki's reminder of why these topics are so important and highlighting the direct links into the SDGs. It's a useful framework for the conversation that we're having. But first, some context on fossil fuel subsidies and why it's important to New Zealand and to our colleagues. The empirical evidence supporting the need for action on fossil fuel subsidies to meet climate change and environmental objectives is increasingly clear. Effectively addressing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies can deliver economic, social, and environmental benefits, as well as releasing government funds to support green and climate-resilient COVID-19 recovery. Since the late 2000s, and perhaps this goes to the length of time that New Zealand has been talking about this issue, our leaders have recognised this potential and committed to rationalising and phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in a range of international fora. Commitments have been made through the UN SDGs, in APEC, in the G20, in the G7, and also in the Vulnerable 20, the V20. But despite the growing evidence of the fiscal burden of such subsidies to governments and their overt conflict with international commitments to reduce carbon emissions, these aspirational words have not yet, so far, translated into swift action. Fossil fuel subsidies have continued to steadily increase, and we can have a conversation about numbers, but that amounts to around $50 billion in 2019. And some governments have even reversed positive reforms to fossil fuel subsidy policies since the beginning of the pandemic. So with that, it feels that we are at a crucial moment of both risk and of opportunity. Significant fiscal stimulus packages are being implemented to support the COVID-19 economic recovery. And if those packages are not designed with climate consideration in mind, there is a risk that we lock in emissions-intensive pathways well into the future. However, these packages also provide an opportunity to accelerate transformation to clean, green energy systems. So we are convinced that fossil fuel subsidies must be addressed if we are to reach our goals, our collective goals in the Paris Agreement. In addition to our own domestic review and reform of indirect support measures, we are a leading advocate for fossil fuel subsidy reform internationally. We, I say New Zealand. Global problems require global solutions, particularly problems of this scale. And we heard that same message, nearly word for word, on the update on plastics. It's New Zealand's view that effective and long-lasting reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies needs to occur in the rules-based multilateral setting. Just like with the current fisheries subsidies negotiations, and thank you DTG for reminding us of the importance of that work, the World Trade Organization is well equipped to develop disciplines to address harmful fossil fuel subsidies, given its legal frameworks, its existing legal frameworks, and the transparency mechanism that we so rely on. To drive this work forward on fossil fuel subsidy reform, New Zealand is once again leading efforts to issue a joint ministerial statement at MC12, the 12th Ministerial Conference, which we are building up to in November, very end of November. This will build on the statement that New Zealand and 11 other WTO members issued at the 11th Ministerial Conference, MC11, in 2017. Our effort with the ministerial statements is intended to continue building a supportive international setting for addressing fossil fuel subsidies multilaterally, as well as to assist with the domestic reform programs. A few words on the actual statement. The revised statement that we are working on will be strengthened, both in substance and we very much hope in the number and geographic spread of the co-sponsors. I want to highlight 4 particular elements of the statement and to demonstrate what is actually included in the text of a ministerial statement. First, signatories will confirm their commitment to the rationalisation and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies along a clear timeline. Second, they will rightly acknowledge that reform must take account of the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise the potential adverse impacts on their development. And this development component is a critical component of the statement. Third, co-sponsors will commit to sharing information and experiences to advance discussions at the WTO, ultimately aimed at achieving ambitious and effective disciplines, including through enhanced transparency to enable us to better evaluate trade, economics, and environmental effects of these subsidies. And finally, but importantly, co-sponsors will agree to work on and elaborate concrete options for taking this issue forward, in advance of the WTO's 13th Ministerial Conference. So it's an ongoing work program, building from MC11 through MC12 and into MC13. On the revised statement, we have welcomed early indications of co-sponsorship from a range of members, from Chile, from Costa Rica, Iceland, the European Union and its member states, from Liechtenstein, Moldova, Norway, Switzerland, and Fiji. So it's an impressive and it's a growing group of members. We are actively encouraging all WTO members to consider co-sponsorship of the statement ahead of MC12, and therefore to have a concrete role in helping to shape the possible options for advancing this issue in the WTO in the period after MC12. We would really appreciate your help, this community's help, in securing the broadest support possible for the statement and the important work that we have ahead. You asked earlier about how this community can help. I would really echo Ambassador de Boer's comments around engaging with your delegation. It's a very important vehicle. And second, the importance of adding stakeholder voices to the conversation. You can help us to bring the issues forward, to bring your technical expertise and understanding of the issue through into the WTO. So I really look forward to continuing that conversation, both with members and with this community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. So it's now time for questions and answers. So I encourage all of those of you online to please submit them online, and I will try and take as many of those as I can. But meanwhile, to get us started, I wanted to ask, I'm not sure if are we going to light it for the people in the room? I'm not sure. But we were going to start first with a question from one of our students, actually at the Graduate Institute. I'm not sure if we can bring her where is she? Dipashri, can you see? Okay, she's over there, great. All right. Thank you. You can go ahead just from there. That's fine. Voila. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you for being here, all of you. And the talks were super insightful. I had two questions regarding the WTO environment topics. The first one is WTO tends to face a lot of pessimism and criticisms on certain issues, and one of them is, as you have mentioned, the fisheries negotiations that has been going on for 20 years. And given that this is a very critical and important matter for many developing and least developed countries, why has it been so hard and long to conclude these crucial negotiations, and what is different now? And my second question would be more on the side of innovation in terms of environment. So to what extent is WTO considering and taking into account seriously the role of technologies, for example, AI and blockchain in supply chains? And what kind of partnerships is WTO initiating around this area? So thank you.
Great, thank you. So could I turn that first, perhaps you could each respond if you'd like to, but starting with DDG Palgam and then Ambassador Tihanki.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Madam, for the question. I'm not sure that I fully get the second one, but I understood it was about technology and environment. On the first one, fish. Well, there are several factors which makes it extremely difficult. One of them is not peculiar to fish; it is just historical. And you mentioned the developing countries, and we are now in a state of play of the planet where developing countries do not feel guilty about the offer of fishing. They have not been the one which have been devastating the oceans. And part of the discussions is about why the not guilty one should enter disciplines and maybe self-constrained their ability to move into such economic activity while they did not create the problem. To some extent, you have that in climate change also. Well, I think that this is what we are trying to sort out in the negotiation, this is what makes it very difficult. But at the end of the day, the dilemma that we face is that whomever is guilty of the situation, we have to fix the situation, because other than that, we all lose. So the balance and the proportionality of contributions is something which has to be part of the result, and this is what we are trying to find. Now, there are other elements which are a little bit derived from what I just from the big picture I just mentioned. Is, for instance, you have some of our members who consider that you can make a distinction between good subsidies and bad subsidies, and allegedly you can. Because, for instance, if you take a subsidy which is going to improve the safety of the boat or the selectivity of the nets, it's good for the boat, it's good for the fish, it's not necessarily contributing to overfishing. So those members say, so we can make this distinction because we have management systems of the stocks. So at the end of the day, it's not about eliminating all subsidies, it's about being selective. But other countries say, wait, what do you want to get away with? Because you have this ability to manage, we do not have the capacity, we need something more simple. This is very hard to also to compromise on, because there are points on all sides. I'm quite confident that we are going to make it. We have a very able, very dedicated, I must say that, and a very dedicated chair, which is doing everything. He's not doing chairing a negotiation. He's embarked on a cause very personally. So Santiago Wills, I'd like to commend him on behalf of the Secretariat. Our DG is very committed, and our members do understand the stake. So we are going to overcome this situation, but it's not really easy, and we are trying our best to bring it to an end before the ministerial. I hope that answers your question. Maybe I stop there.
No, perfect. Ambassador Tihanki, do you want to reply as well? There's one, yeah, just there.
Yes, just to add, I think just on the developing country perspective, I think DDG Jean-Marie pointed it out that indeed more and more developing country ministers are being made more aware that we have to find a win-win. At the same time, there's this issue of sophistication and capacity. So I think an aspect of it is really the capacity building and the resource management systems that other countries have a more advanced stage of. So I think, again, it's a matter of committing to that goal. And indeed, the negotiations have indeed heated up over the last 2 to 3 years, which is, it had been in hiatus before that. So when we do say 20 years, it's part of our strategy to push people to the end. But if you really look at it, it reactivated in the last 2 to 3 years, and much progress has been made. So keep on pushing, keep on pressuring through constituent lobby. Just on the technology and innovation, it is a very important topic. It has been revived across the sectors in the WTO. There is the JSI Joint Initiative on E-commerce. So much work has been ongoing the past 2 years. And actually, if you go to the website of the coordinators, they're actually dealing with source code, with data transmission, free flow. So many, it's quite in an advanced stage in coordination with digital policies of the member states, as well as in coordination with other organizations. But it also became quite apparent that this is important with the pandemic, with what happened with the virtual platforms and virtual meetings like we're having now. So I think that's a very hot topic. Things are happening not only digitally, but also transfer of technology and other issues in the environment. So it's a hot topic that indeed we have to keep on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Daniela, did you want to say something too? Please. I think it might just come on magically if you start.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much for the question. I will address the question on technology and innovation, I think it's very relevant to plastic, to address plastic pollution, but also in terms of finding or identifying opportunities for countries in the circular economy for plastics. So it's I can say that this is an issue that it's been addressed by many members in many ways, how to address trade-related capacity building and technical assistance needs for developing members, and in particular, of course, least developed members, in order to support efforts to use technologies, to facilitate access to technology, to address recycling, improve plastics waste, but also to expand trade for sustainable substitutes, for example, including non-plastic products. So this is a very important issue in terms of plastics, and I think technology and innovation is a cross-cutting issue, but I will only address the plastic side. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Daniela. And just, I have two questions. I'm going to take the gentleman in the middle, and just while we're waiting, oh, you have the camera. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Pierre. I'm a second-year international affairs student here at the Institute. My question is for you, Mr. Jean-Marie. So how would you consider the adoption of a WTO climate waiver, which is championed by former Appellate Body Chief Judge James Backus, in order to allow members to adopt climate response measures as per their commitments under the Paris Agreement, even if they are WTO inconsistent and they cannot enjoy the protection of GATT Article 20, in order to avoid a collision between the two international regimes? Thank you.
Great. Just before you answer, I'm just going to take another couple of questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. That fits beautifully to what I was going to ask. Thanks first for this fantastic panel. I think the composition is just fantastic. In terms of substance and process, we've heard almost everything, and there is still so much more to be discussed. I like elephants a lot, so let me address the one in the room. CBAM. What are we going to do with carbon pricing and the WTO? It is, I think, no less than a sea change if it is coming. I think carbon pricing is coming definitely in one way or another. And that means the trading system will have to address the question, how does it deal with the internalization of externalities? First on climate, but I think the same question can be asked with respect to other environmental externalities that could be internalized and then adjusted or addressed at the border. This goes definitely 2 steps beyond the current tariff-based system. Of course, we have long moved beyond that system, but there is still a lot of that in the minds and the hearts of people. So in other words, is the WTO ready for carbon pricing? And then perhaps piggybacking on the question that was just asked before, can technology help address fears that we would have not been able to address 10 years ago, but maybe now can do if we look at the carbon footprints, proving carbon footprints, distinguishing between big ones and small ones, perhaps through tools such as blockchain. So can the system adapt to this and accommodate what so many people think needs to be accommodated in one way or another? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for those questions. I'm going to throw it, I'll just wait for the next round, if that's okay, because we've got 3 going. I hate to throw the tough climate ones at you, Jean-Marie. Okay, I'll get the 3rd question, but go ahead, you two.
It's just a comment to share with your official representative about innovations and the current negotiations still running in WIPO, in worldwide intellectual property organizations. And if you said innovation, we think also about genetic resources. And if we said genetic resources, we said environment, climate change, biodiversity. And this committee in WIPO twice a year about genetic resources and traditional knowledge, and hopefully international legal treaties. Because if we said genetic resources, it's future product, pharma product. And it is linked also with public health. And this tripartite dialogue still running since 5 more than, because state members didn't agree between each other to implement the expert committee on WIPO, WTO, and WHO. It's still just symposium and just a dialogue until now. And the yearly meeting happened today. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I might just throw one of my own in also for Alison, just that you also have an issue that's been on the agenda for a long time, fossil fuel subsidy reform. And of course, we have the UN Secretary General calling almost weekly for action. We have COP26 coming up, and we do see more and more countries now committing to phasing out. Even China last week made new commitments on phasing out investment in coal abroad, I think it was. Do you think that we're at the cusp of a shift, that you might be able to attract more members to this going forward? Or is it something that, you know, there are just too many underlying concerns? So that's something for you as well. But I'll start with Jean-Marie, please.
Thank you, Caroline. I thought that the fish one was difficult, but this is more difficult. Okay, let me try to very briefly tell you how we see, or at least I see things on carbon and climate waiver. Now, there are first two things to always keep in mind. The first thing is that environment is recognized in the multilateral trading system as having a superior value to trade. So this is what, since the GATT, it was Article 20. It is a preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement. So there is no discussion about that. And climate change, of course, if you have an agreement like the Paris Agreement signed by even more countries than you have WTO members, is going to be recognized as a legitimate objective. That's what. Second, carbon pricing. I think RDG has been very clear on that. She's an economist, so she says carbon pricing should be global. This is the most efficient way of dealing with climate change, and we need to work, including with all the competent organizations, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank. We all agree that a global price on carbon pricing would be the first best solutions. Now, all your questions stem from the fact that we do not have this first best solution at this stage, and there are 50 shades of gray, if I may allow myself, on the possible solution from multilateral, from global to sovereign or unilateral solutions, which have been contemplated. So what do we do with that from a WTO perspective? You have three ways of doing your carbon pricing unilaterally, if according to the treaties. One way is non-discrimination. This is technically Article 2 and 3 of the GATT. One way is exception. This is technically Article 20. One way is waiver, which is Article 9 of the Marrakesh Agreement. Those three solutions are possible. They have drawbacks and benefits in terms of legal certainty and economic efficiency. I think from an economic point of view, the most efficient one is non-discrimination. And I think from a legal certainty point of view, the most efficient one is the waiver. So this is the perimeter in which we are discussing. Now, what are the benefits and of different solutions? Personally, I think the waiver would be ideal, but to get to the waiver, it would be probably more difficult than to get to a global pricing on carbon. So the feasibility of it, that's where my little divergence with James Bacchus is. I discussed that with him on the panel. It's about the feasibility, not about the idea. The non-discrimination route is the one which has been chosen by the European Union, and from this I cover the elephant in the room, which is the proposition of CBAM. Of course, nobody knows whether this is WTO compatible, because this theoretically, to be sure of the answer, you would need to have an appellate body decision on it. This means that you would go to litigation first. Now, we have reason to think that the European Union has been working very, very closely to ensure WTO compatibility. And you can see that when you look at the details of the system, WTO compatibility will be based on the fact that there is no discrimination between European enterprises and importers of foreign goods to whom the CBAM will be applied. Now, in principle, this non-discrimination is embedded in the proposition. The European Union has announced 3 years of transition period as a blank shot, so they will test the mechanism to just see where the problems are. I think that we can give them the idea that this is a signal of openness to discussion, to making the system work without being discriminatory. And at the end, it will be implemented over a period, I don't have it exactly in mind, but several years, during which they will reduce the free allocation of emission permits, which is the benefit that European enterprises are receiving, and raise the CBAM. So I think it's very transitional, and from that perspective, I think we can give a chance to the fact that the non-discrimination route is probably possible to explore. Now, we all know that in those matters, the devil is in the detail. The EU will have to take into account the efforts which are being made by third countries under different policies, such as carbon sink and or carbon tax, etc. So there will be a need for dialogue. What we say, and here I can speak more officially than personally, is that the WTO can provide all the forum to discuss that rather than going to litigation in 10 years. And I think the CTE is a place to start, but all other committees can be places to start. It's just upon our members whether they want to act in that. Last word about technology. Of course, technology can help. It is one example of what I was trying to say in my initial intervention about the moving from exception to solution, about win-win solutions. So the environmental good agreement, for instance, which some of our members want to reactivate, contains a lot of goods which could be disseminated by lowering their tariffs for the sake of climate change. I'm a little too long, but the topic is not a simple one. So thank you.
It's not easy at all. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Tihanki, and then I have some more questions to pose, so you can't escape yet.
That's the best thing when I'm in the panel with Jean-Marie. He can answer the hard questions, and I have to say it's very important that Jean-Marie really knows the topic and is really devoted to global governance, good governance, and you can see in his responses how the issue of the climate waiver is. Just to add my own 2 cents on a climate waiver, indeed. I just want to echo that achieving the waiver is sometimes 10 times more difficult than actually doing the national measure and actually implementing your climate action measures nationally. As I say, nationally, regionally, if it's a economic partnership agreement, you can have your regional, and of course the EU is a kind of a regional integration area. Then you can have your own exceptions, which is Article 20. And then of course the end goal is maybe the multilateral trading system, which is a multilateral result, which is kind of the most difficult, which the waiver has elements of needing a consensus on that. So indeed, just to echo Article 20 and the hierarchy of environment measures is recognized already at this stage. So, which brings me to the interesting, the CBAM, because with that context, of course, the EU is completely at liberty to start implementing its own national or regional policies, but these have to pass the test. And that is where I can say that the Committee on Trade and Environment has provided a forum. In the last 2-3 meetings, members have been able to raise questions at the committee, and the EU has been able to present briefings on this Green Deal even before its implementation. So I think that's one of the importance of having a forum at the WTO. And on the issue of carbon taxes, I'm very pleased that since 1994, the founding work program of the Committee on Trade and Environment already has this issue of border tax adjustments. And many papers actually in the early years were made on this. And of course, it has ebbs and flows. But then with this discussion, it really just fits in perfectly into one of our existing work program mandates, which is border tax adjustments. Again, I'm not saying we have a solution, but it's a perfect forum where delegations and members can exchange ideas towards win-win solution or more results-oriented measures. So I think that's
great.
I got those two. On intellectual property, of course, just on the WIPO, WTO, WHO partnership. Indeed, it's one of my favorites because MDG 8 speaks of global partnership and SDG 17 speaks of global partnership. And only with a global partnership among organizations and the members and the NGOs and academia can we achieve real practical results. And I emphasize practical results because, as the lady has pointed out, some things take too long to achieve. But if we're focusing on pragmatic results, maybe there can be on-the-ground benefits. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Just before you answer, Alison, I have a question from one of our people online. It's from Puspa Sharma, who works in Nepal for the South Asian Network on Trade and Environment. And he has asked a question. He noted that for countries such as Nepal, border taxes are a major source of revenue, including for fossil fuel imports and for tariffs on vehicles run using fossil fuels. And he said in such a case, there's a trade-off between the economy and the environment, as the government would lose significant revenue by switching to electronic vehicles. So he says, what could be the way forward for countries like that? I'm sure that's something that you have thought about in the context of your revised ministerial statement. If you could comment on that too, would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll do my best. First, on the CBAM point, it's a very, very good question and a really important topic that we must all grapple with. And I think you very close to provided the answer when you answered the question, which was to ask, is the multilateral system ready to tackle it? The answer, I think, is in the multilateral system, that we should be talking to our partners, to other WTO members about the way that these types of measures are designed and implemented to ensure that they are designed in a way that can meet both our environmental and our trade objectives. So I think we have the processes, we have the CTE, we have the WTO and its range of different bodies. We also have the TESSD, which has to be one of the most difficult acronyms that we deal with, to provide the fora for those conversations to take place. And they are taking place. So we might not have the answers, but we're certainly trying to have the conversation. You asked whether we're on the cusp of making progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform. I certainly hope so. I think the answer from a New Zealand delegate has to be yes, but a little bit more context. The climate crisis would certainly require us to be on that cusp, and COVID and the crisis we are currently dealing with perhaps provides a momentum push to ensure that the spend governments are making in terms of economic recovery is also done in a way that is pursuing our climate objectives and not increasing the spend on fossil fuel subsidies. I certainly agree with your point that there have been important political commitments made. You referred to China. I would also refer to the positive statements that we have seen coming from the Biden administration and the important weight that the US has in this space. And when I spoke earlier, I talked about the raft of different political commitments and contexts that have addressed the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, the G20, the G7, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps also worth highlighting that some free trade agreements have also tried to grapple, and also that New Zealand, along with our partners in the ACS negotiation, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, is also trying to make a concerted effort to make legally binding disciplines to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. So yes, there is increasing political momentum, I hope. And yes, there are increasing efforts in a range of different contexts to try to take that next step. And the statement that we are working on for MC12 is just one of a multitude of different actions. In terms of the very poignant question about the trade-off between trade objectives, environment objectives, revenue, and the development component, certainly something that we have thought about and continue to think about in the context of the fossil fuel subsidy reform work, but also perhaps broadening, coming up a level in all of our trade and environment work, in all of our work in the WTO, we have to consider that development dimension and consider what are the needs of developing countries when it comes to the topics that we're talking about? How can we ensure that development objectives are pursued and able to be pursued in the context of the commitments of the disciplines that we're working on? In the fossil fuel space, we're not yet at the point of disciplines or rules that we are trying to implement. So we haven't yet got to the second part of the question, which is what is the space that developing countries might need within those rules. But we would certainly hope that in the work in the lead up to MC13, which I know we're all hugely focused on MC12 right now, as we must be, but as we continue our work next year, we would be very hopeful that as we design the concrete actions that we take, we're also talking to developing countries about what it is within those concrete actions that they would need in order to be able to join the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. We have just 5 minutes left, and I've got one last question for Daniela and also a last great question from someone online. So just for Daniela, one of the questions we had was around how can we ensure there's no duplication of work between the kind of work that goes on at the WTO and other multilateral environmental processes. It could be at the UNFCCC. And I was thinking of you when I saw the question because, of course, Ecuador is not only a co-sponsor of the IDP, but has also recently been involved in the ministerial meeting for a treaty on plastic pollution. So how do you see these efforts in the multilateral environmental governance and trade governance as being complementary?
Thank you, Caroline. Indeed, it's an excellent question. So I will answer this. As you mentioned, Ecuador is at the front at the UN, at UNEP, at the UNIA process, promoting and binding instruments to tackle global plastics pollution, but also is very active at the Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam with the Rotterdam Conventions. And there are many forums for us that are actually addressing this area. UNTAD as well has been very active in terms of technical assistance and capacity building in plastics. And I think that when I mentioned in the intervention that we have received a lot of input for many stakeholders, it has included also input from the BRS Secretariat, UNEP, UNTAD, and a lot of stakeholders to not duplicate. One of the objectives we have, it's not duplicate work, but more looking for a complementary approach, a collective approach, and cooperate between processes that exist in this area. As you mentioned, we are actually the ministerial coordinated by UNEP and co-hosted by Ecuador, Ghana, Vietnam, and Germany. Took place at the WTO, and it was great. There was the commitment from a lot of countries pushing for a global instrument in plastics, and many of these countries are part of the ADP as well. So we do see that there is complementarity in these processes, and countries working in these many fronts that covers the problematic. It is a challenge as well. It is a challenge as well domestically to have the environment ministry, the trade ministry, sitting down together to tackle this issue. But that's a thing we have also been working with, and I think we have been successful. And that's something that we should think about when we talk about the trade community and the environmental community. We need to build trust between these two communities and actually look towards at the common goal we have and how complementary is trade and environment to be successful in this problematic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I mean, I think it's a point that's been made really for over a decade or two by many in the environmental community, and I know the executive director of UNEP is that we need to engage environment ministries more in this discussion of trade and environment, and that's really something that needs to happen at the national level. We'll only have coherence internationally when there's a better process for dialogue and policy coherence at the national level. I'm going to wrap up, but before I do, there's just this one last great question, which I thought is a great question from stakeholders. I'm just going to find it. And a good one to keep us honest here is she has said, given that we have less than 10 years to keep global warming to less than 1.5 degrees, have any of the committees and initiatives set themselves any concrete timelines for taking action beyond dialogue? And, you know, so I think it's really trying to push to what's going to come out of all of this. And I'm going to put Jean-Marie on the spot and say, how do we think about, but I think it's important, how do we think about impact in the multilateral trade context? Because it's very complex. But well, I can ask the others to put you all on the spot, but I just...
I would really like to have Stefan answering that question, because probably the best place to hope for a deadline, at least, or for some process, remember, is going to be the trade and sustainable structure discussion. This is the most advanced initiative. Now, in terms of deadline, not that I know within the WTO, because the WTO has just no mandate to discuss on climate change as a holistic approach, with a holistic approach. What we have is questions raised about climate change, CBAM being one, under technical, and this does not come yet with this sense of urgency that you haven't been mentioning. Hope that satisfies, but I'd like to hear my neighbor.
Are you brave to close? No. So I think that one of the things I was going to say is that what's slightly different, the fisheries subsidies negotiation, of course, they have taken a long time. And you did mention that there's sort of been a resurgence in recent years, so we shouldn't necessarily describe it as being a 20-year-long negotiation. But one of the challenges is that it's looking for binding multilateral rules. And that's a really, really complex thing to push forward with at this time. But many of the other member-led initiatives are really about creating collaborations, partnerships, voluntary actions among willing countries. And so there is, I think, quite strong potential as we move past the ministerial for governments to find particular areas that they wish to work on together and agree to voluntarily move forward on. And I think that applies in the case of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. A subset of countries can move forward. Similarly on plastics, groups of countries can move forward on issues of interest to them. And I think in the context of TESTI as well, we can expect some concrete efforts to deliver some specific outputs. But I think certainly what we will need is the engagement of this wider stakeholder community to push governments and hold them to account on all of this and say, we don't have 20 years to wait for solutions. We need you to work harder and faster to find ways to cooperate. So that would be my plea to all of those who are watching today. So as our time is drawn to a close, I hope that you have found the briefing useful today, and please join with me in thanking our speakers for their time today. I think your interventions have really helped us understand the efforts that are underway and the opportunities for stakeholders to engage and support those. I'd like to thank Dimitri and my colleagues from the Geneva Trade Platform for hosting us graciously today. And let me close by encouraging you all to explore the agenda for this week's Geneva Trade Week. For those interested in environment and trade, there is a dialogue tomorrow, a conversation tomorrow morning between the UK's ambassador to the UN and WTO and the executive director of the International Trade Centre. So it'll be Ambassador Manley and Pamela Coke-Hamilton. And today is also the last chance for any of you who are keen to register with the WTO Public Forum for virtual participation. And there's a whole range of exciting events on different aspects of trade and sustainability then. So I would really encourage you to join those. So thank you again for joining us today. Thank you again to our speakers. And that's it. Thank you very much.